May 5, 1945. In the darkest hours of the night. On the Maeda Escarpment in Okinawa, the night did not stay silent. It shattered. Heavy engines roared in the darkness, and boots hammered the ground like war drums, and Japanese voices shouted sharp orders as an entire battalion surged uphill toward the American lines. Artillery began to fall, and every explosion tore open the night, lighting the 400-foot ridge in brief, hellish flashes. In the middle of that chaos, Private First Class Desmond Doss crouched in a shallow foxhole that barely offered protection. Around him, screams filled the air. "Medic! Medic!" The cries came from everywhere at once, from wounded men scattered across the torn and bleeding summit, and Desmond Doss had no rifle. He had never carried one, not in 3 years of army service. His hands held only a medical kit, and his lips moved in a simple prayer that became his rhythm for the night. "Lord, help me get one more." Then he stood up. He stepped out of his foxhole, walked directly into the artillery fire, and began the work that would earn him the Medal of Honor, the highest award for valor in the United States. This story answers a question that has haunted military history for generations. What makes a man worthy of America's highest decoration for courage? For most soldiers, the math is simple. Enemy casualties, ground taken, objectives achieved. But between April 29th and May 5th, 1945, during the fiercest days of fighting on the Maeda Escarpment, Corporal Desmond Thomas Doss erased that equation completely. He saved 75 American lives on the deadliest battlefield of Okinawa. He did it while bombs and bullets fell like rain, and he did it all without firing a single shot, because his Seventh-day Adventist faith forbade him from taking a human life. The men who fought beside him remembered a very different Desmond Doss from the early years. They remembered training camps where he was called Holy Joe, a nickname soaked in contempt. They remembered officers who tried again and again to discharge him, unable to accept a soldier who insisted on serving without a weapon. Captain Jack Glover, a battalion staff officer, made his position brutally clear. "We're going to war, and it's kill or be killed, and you're not going to be at my damned side if you don't carry a gun." But something changed between the mockery of 1942 and the medal ceremony in October 1945. And it was not Desmond Doss. He never wavered. What changed was everyone around him. By May 1945, the same soldiers who once ridiculed him trusted him with their lives. The officers who tried to remove him would later call him the bravest man they had ever known. This is the story of that transformation, and of 7 days in hell that proved a powerful truth. Courage does not always come from the barrel of a gun. When Desmond Doss stepped off the landing craft onto Okinawa's beaches in April 1945, he carried a reputation that had been 3 years in the making. The other men in Company B, 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment of the 77th Infantry Division, knew the essential truth about their medic by now. If you got hit, regardless of where or how, Doss would reach you. He'd proven it on Guam in July 1944, earning his first Bronze Star by repeatedly leaving cover to treat casualties under sniper and machine gun fire. He'd proven it again. He proved it again 4 months later on the island of Leyte in the Philippines, where his determination to reach wounded soldiers under heavy fire earned him a second Bronze Star. But the path to earning that trust had been brutal. Desmond was a Virginia native, the middle of 3 children raised by Tom and Bertha Doss in a devout Seventh-day Adventist household. The family kept the Sabbath on Saturdays and lived by the 10 Commandments as literal instructions, particularly the 6th one, "Thou shalt not kill." When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, Desmond felt the same outrage that swept America. He wanted to serve. But he also knew, with unshakable certainty, that he could never take another human life. In April 1942, 4 months after Pearl Harbor, he enlisted with what seemed to him a simple solution. He would serve as a medic, saving lives instead of taking them. The army assigned him to the infantry, and the problems began immediately. During basic training, he refused weapons drill. He refused rifle training. He refused to do the most fundamental things that defined infantry service. His fellow recruits watched this slight, soft-spoken Virginian stubbornly decline to carry a rifle, and the nickname came quickly. "Holy Joe," they called him, and the name carried no affection. The training months became a special kind of isolation. Other men wouldn't share foxholes with someone they considered a coward. Some tried to beat the stubbornness out of him. His superiors made multiple attempts to transfer or discharge him. At one point, his refusal to carry a weapon went so far that his commanders considered court-martial charges. But after legal review, the Army's own lawyers ruled that there was no lawful basis to punish him for acting on his religious conscience. But Desmond held firm through every attempt to break him, and after repeated reviews, the Army formally recognized his status as a conscientious objector and approved his deployment to combat zones as an unarmed medic. His only comfort during those dark months came from the letters he wrote to his sweetheart Dorothy. While other soldiers cleaned weapons or practiced marksmanship, Desmond could often be found hunched over paper, writing home. The other men would shake their heads, certain that Holy Joe wouldn't last a week in actual combat. At 25 years old and weighing just 120 pounds, he didn't look like anyone's idea of a warrior. Guam changed that perception. In July 1944, when Company B first came under fire and someone called for a medic, Desmond didn't hesitate. He left his foxhole and ran toward the wounded soldier, often exposing himself to fire from Japanese positions just yards away. The first time might have been luck. The 5th time, the 10th time, his comrades started recognizing something else at work. By the time Guam was secured, the ridicule had quieted. At Later Gulf 4 months later, the pattern repeated. Doss venturing repeatedly into heavy fire to reach casualties, treating wounded from his company and neighboring units alike. By April 1945, Desmond Doss had earned deep respect within his company and was widely trusted by the men who fought beside him. Despite giving away his meat rations to other soldiers, despite his slight build, his reputation towered over larger men. The soldiers knew one essential truth. If they got hit, Doss would reach them. By the time the division reached Okinawa, Doss had already saved dozens of wounded soldiers across multiple campaigns, and his comrades no longer questioned whether he would come for them. But none of them could have imagined what was waiting ahead on a jagged limestone ridge that would test every principle he believed in. Before one assault on Okinawa, Doss refused to move from his position until he was allowed a brief moment to pray, and when the attack finally went forward, it succeeded with fewer casualties than expected. The Maeda Escarpment rose 400 feet from the Okinawan landscape like a natural fortress. The Maeda Escarpment rose like a natural fortress in central Okinawa, and it guarded the approaches to the Shuri defenses. Japanese engineers had spent months transforming this limestone ridge into a defensive position that American artillery and naval guns couldn't break. The crest changed sharply from place to place. In some spots it was only a few feet wide, and farther along it widened to roughly 150 to 200 feet, and it was riddled with caves, tunnels, and fighting positions, trenches and cave systems that connected through underground tunnels. Behind this natural wall lay the plateau leading to Shuri Castle, headquarters of the Japanese 32nd Army. Taking the escarpment meant opening the door to southern Okinawa. Failing to take it meant the entire American advance would stall, but reaching the summit required solving an immediate problem: the cliff face itself. 30 to 40 feet of near vertical limestone stood between American positions and the ridge top. A fully loaded infantryman carrying rifle, ammunition, grenades, and water couldn't simply climb that wall, especially with enemy soldiers waiting at the top. On April 29, 1945, at 10:20 in the morning, When the 307th Infantry Regiment arrived at positions facing this obstacle, the tactical challenge was clear. Earlier attempts to put men on the crest were punished instantly, and in one failed effort, the first 3 soldiers who reached the top were killed at once by machine gun fire. Their bodies might still be up there somewhere. During the night of April 30th into May 1st, the battalion brought up 50-foot ladders and several cargo nets borrowed from the Navy, and by May 1st the men began using them to reach the crest under heavy enemy fire. Hand-over-hand upswaying cargo mesh, knowing that machine gun fire could cut them down at any moment. The limestone was sharp enough to tear skin. Behind them, below them, Company B waited to see if this risky plan would work. Somehow all 3 volunteers reached the summit and secured the nets. Later accounts and images are often shared about that climb, but the core truth is clear. The first men up had to secure the gear while fully exposed to fire from above, his slight figure silhouetted against the sky. Below him, soldiers from Company B were beginning their climb, struggling upward with full combat gear. Lieutenant Gaunto led 20 picked men, and before the climb began, Doss had led them in a short prayer at the base, a quiet conversation with God asking for protection. The men pulled themselves up those nets, muscle by muscle. When they reached the top and spread out across the narrow summit, the 307th Regiment's after-action report captured what happened next with brutal honesty. When the flat top of the escarpment was reached, however, the real hell broke loose. To their left, Company A was being slaughtered. Machine gun fire from multiple positions caught them in crossfire, and men fell wounded or dead across the summit. But in one sector, Company B used the cargo nets to get men onto the edge of the escarpment by nightfall, but Japanese counterattacks later that night drove them back off the crest, only one wounded by flying rock fragments rather than bullets. The contrast with Company A's fate was stark. Now began the savage work of clearing Japanese positions. Company B moved from spider hole to pillbox, using satchel charges that exploded with concussions that could kill everyone inside. Grenades followed, then small arms fire. In fights like this, American troops often relied on satchel charges, grenades, and sometimes flamethrowers to force defenders out of caves and bunkers. Another GI rushed up to turn on the fuel supply, and the sudden burst of flame made the operator recoil from the heat. By evening of April 30th, Company B had cleared several positions and established a small foothold on the ridge. But the foothold did not last. Around midnight, Japanese troops launched fierce counterattacks. Fighting turned close and chaotic in the darkness, and after hours of combat, American soldiers were driven back off the escarpment. Then darkness brought something worse. The 307th's records noted that during that night, during the night of April 30th into May 1st, the area was hammered by intense shelling, and Japanese troops launched close-range counterattacks that forced American soldiers off parts of the crest. The official report stated simply, "After severe hand-to-hand fighting, all of the attackers were killed." Possibly during this first chaotic night, though the exact timing remains unclear in the historical record, Desmond encountered a soldier who'd, at one point, Doss found a soldier who was critically wounded and lying motionless in a shell hole. Others might have assumed he could not be saved, but Doss dragged him to the cliff edge and lowered him down on a rope-supported litter to the medics waiting below. Doss dragged the legless soldier back to the cliff edge, rigged a litter to rope, and carefully lowered him down to medical personnel waiting below. Whether that soldier ultimately survived isn't recorded. But because of Desmond, he at least had a chance. May 1st, 1945. As pale light revealed the cost of the first night's fighting, Company B faced another day of brutal close-quarters combat. Throughout the day, they continued clearing Japanese positions using the same methodical violence: satchel charges, grenades, flamethrowers, small arms. By evening, the unit had destroyed several Japanese positions and secured a large portion of the escarpment's crest, although heavy resistance remained. But clearing ground was only half the battle. Wounded men had to be evacuated, and the cliff that had challenged the assault now challenged rescue. Throughout the day and into the night, Desmond worked between fighting positions and the cliff edge. When someone got hit, he'd reach their position, assess wounds, bind what could be bound, inject morphine, then drag or carry them through mud and shell craters to the evacuation point. That night saw continued artillery fire, lighter than the night before, but still dangerous enough to keep everyone tense and alert. Reinforcements climbed the nets under darkness. Ammunition was hauled up. The wounded were lowered down, and Desmond continued moving between casualties, treating men from Company B and neighboring units, working often by feeling alone in the darkness. On May 2nd, 1945, American artillery opened a heavy bombardment against Japanese positions south of the escarpment, a scene later recorded in wartime footage from the campaign, shells arcing through air to explode among enemy defenses. When the guns fell silent, the 307th's 1st Battalion pushed south off the ridge toward the plateau beyond. The fire they met was savage. Despite a full day of fighting, the battalion made very limited progress, and one platoon suffered devastating losses that left only a handful of men able to continue. Everyone else was dead, wounded, or too shell-shocked to function. Through it all, Desmond moved among them, treating casualties from multiple companies throughout the day and into another night. By now, he'd gone days without real sleep. The physical toll of carrying wounded men, often men heavier than himself, over torn ground while crawling through mud and over sharp limestone would have broken most soldiers. But he kept moving. The emotional weight, seeing men he knew torn apart, having their blood literally on his hands as he tried to stop bleeding or bind shattered limbs, hearing their cries for help or for their mothers. That weight he carried differently, possibly through prayer, possibly through sheer determination not to let them down. May 3rd, 1945. The morning brought renewed efforts to clear the summit completely. Company B and other 307th elements began what official reports called mopping up, the brutal work of ensuring every Japanese position was truly cleared. They destroyed the remaining Japanese positions on the summit, and that night the enemy launched a large and desperate counterattack, which failed after fierce and costly fighting. The attack had failed, but American casualties mounted, and again Desmond ran his circuit through the night, treating wounded as mortar fire fell with steady rhythm. Lieutenant Gaunto, commanding the 1st Platoon throughout this entire period from April 29th through May 8th, watched Doss work day after day and night after night. Later, writing his official testimony, Gaunto would struggle for adequate words. "I was platoon leader of the 1st Platoon of Company B during the period 29th April to 8th May 1945, during which time PFC Desmond Doss was with my platoon as an aide-man." May 4th, 1945. The artillery bombardment that day exceeded everything before. Hat Day, a massive artillery barrage pounded the ridge, tearing the ground apart and turning the summit into mud, rock, and shattered earth. Each explosion threw up geysers of dirt and rock. The summit became little more than a morass of mud-filled shell craters and shattered rocks. The fighting during this period was extremely confusing. Units would hold positions during the day, withdraw to lower slopes at night for resupply, then climb back up in the morning. Through all this chaos, one constant remained. When someone got hit, Doss would reach them. May 5th, 1945. The 6th day. Everyone on the ridge existed in exhaustion beyond anything most had experienced. They were filthy, covered in mud and blood and grime from a week without bathing or changing clothes. They were hungry, living on cold rations. They were numb to explosions and screams. The summit had become a nightmare landscape of craters and debris. Then, shortly before 2 a.m. on what was technically May 6th, the largest Japanese counterattack came. Soldiers on the ridge might have heard them first. the rumble of tank engines mixing with hundreds of feet moving through darkness. A large Japanese force launched a powerful counterattack during the night, supported by heavy weapons and massed infantry assaults, with enough force to overwhelm the American defenders, driving straight at American positions with enough strength to sweep defenders from the ridge entirely. In places, they succeeded. Japanese forces pushed into American lines, reclaimed parts of the summit, and drove GIs back onto lower slopes. Cries of "Medic!" sprang up everywhere, from every direction. And Desmond Doss, possibly the last functioning medic on this section of the escarpment, began what would become the most famous night of his life. He ran from position to position under artillery fire that never stopped, under rifle fire from Japanese soldiers who'd broken through American lines, under mortar fire walking back and forth across the summit. Later testimonies suggest he might have treated dozens of casualties throughout that night. The exact number became impossible to count. He'd reach a wounded soldier, work quickly, bind the worst wounds, inject morphine if needed, then drag or carry the man back toward the cliff edge. At the evacuation point, working by feel in darkness, Doss would rig casualties to rope. Sometimes he secured the rope so it would not slip under the weight of the wounded man knot that wouldn't slip under load. Other times, when speed mattered more than technique, he'd grab the man's uniform collar and lower him hand over hand to soldiers waiting below. Then he'd turn back toward the fighting, back toward the cries for help, and repeat the process. At some point during that night, Desmond began praying aloud. Not formal prayers, just a simple phrase repeated over and over as he worked. "Lord, help me get one more. Save this wounded soldier, then find the next one. Get this man to safety, then show me where to go next. One more. Just let me save one more." The prayer became rhythm, a mantra keeping him moving when his body wanted to collapse. Dawn came slowly on May 6th. At the 307th Aid Post, located in what today is an unremarkable parking lot, but was then a collection point for battlefield casualties, dozens of wounded men had arrived throughout those dark hours. Many of them had been treated and lowered from the ridge by Desmond Doss, each one lowered down that cliff by his hands. Among those casualties was Captain Jack Glover, the officer who'd tried to get Doss discharged, who'd said he'd never be allowed at his side in combat. In darkness and confusion, Doss might not have recognized him initially, just another wounded American who needed help. The irony was almost too perfect. But that was the thing about Desmond Doss. He didn't save people based on whether they'd been kind to him. He saved them because that's what he'd promised to do. One more Japanese attempt came on the night of May 6th, but this attack was bloodily repulsed. American positions held. After 7 days and nights of the most intense fighting most of these soldiers would ever experience, Company B and surviving 307th Elements began an advance that would secure Hacksaw Ridge permanently. The 307th Regiment's after-action report offered this summary. The Battle of the Escarpment, after 7 days of almost 24-hour-a-day fighting, which included everything from medium artillery to knife duels, was over. Some units received sporadic artillery and mortar fire during the night, and a few minor infiltration attempts were made, but the troops otherwise experienced a comparatively quiet night. And they deserved it. A bitterly contested, highly important piece of ground had been won in the face of the most severe fighting any of the troops had experienced. Officially, Desmond Doss was credited with saving 75 men during those 7 days. 75 American soldiers who might have died from blood loss or shock, or simply being unable to get off that exposed ridge made it to medical care because an unarmed medic refused to let them down. Lieutenant Gaunto, writing his formal statement, tried to capture what he'd witnessed. "I feel I can state without reservation that the actions of this man were the most outstanding display of bravery that I have ever seen." Private First Class Doss is a non-combatant, and although he never carried a weapon, I have never seen a wounded man in a position too dangerous for him to go to. The men of my platoon always had the feeling that they could depend on Doss to go to them, regardless of what happened or where. One soldier Doss saved later spoke about being treated under fire. His memory captured something essential about who Desmond was. Desmond Doss was working on me saying, "Take it easy, you'll be all right." I couldn't believe how calm he was. I noticed that he had no weapons, so I offered him my .45. He said to me, "No, I can't kill anybody, that's my religion." And I thought to myself, now, here's a warrior. There it was. The definition of warrior had just been rewritten. It didn't require a rifle. Sometimes the truest warrior was the man who ran toward danger unarmed, who saved lives while others took them, who proved that faith could be stronger than fear. The days following Hacksaw Ridge brought no rest. The 307th continued pushing south towards the 307th, kept pushing south toward Shuri, where the Japanese 32nd Army ran its defense from underground headquarters beneath the Shuri Castle area. As they moved him to cover, the group was caught in an enemy tank attack, and in the confusion, Doss saw a more critically wounded man nearby, so he crawled off the litter and told the bearers to help that man first. The fighting remained brutal, close, and relentless, defined by mud, rain, and terrain that favored defenders. Every ridge and ravine became a killing zone, and progress was measured in yards rather than miles. And Desmond continued serving as Company B's medic, moving constantly between shell holes and shattered rock faces, carrying supplies, bandages, and morphine instead of a rifle. His role did not change after Hacksaw Ridge, only the exhaustion deepened, and the danger became routine rather than exceptional. May 21st, 1945, 3 weeks after Hacksaw Ridge. Company B was attacking high ground near Shuri during a cold, wet night operation. Visibility was poor, communication uncertain, and the enemy well dug in. He stayed in exposed ground while others took cover, and he even risked being mistaken for an enemy infiltrator. But he kept giving aid until the grenade blast wounded him. During the night attack, a Japanese grenade exploded nearby, and fragments tore into his legs, leaving him badly wounded, and Desmond felt warmth running down his legs. Grenade fragments had torn into both his lower legs and buttocks, multiple penetrating wounds. Pain arrived quickly, but training and habit took over before fear or shock could fully set in. The proper procedure would have been calling for another medic immediately. That was what doctrine required, and that was what most wounded men would have done without hesitation. But Desmond looked at his wounds, assessed the danger to anyone else moving through this exposed area, and made a different choice. He understood that another medic crossing open ground under fire might be killed. Instead of calling another aid man from cover, he cared for his own injuries and then waited for 5 hours until litter bearers could reach him without being needlessly exposed, until the tactical situation improved enough that a stretcher party could safely reach him. Only when it was safe for other men did he allow evacuation. Stretcher bearers loaded him onto a litter and began the journey back to the battalion aid station, moving carefully through shell craters and broken ground. But along that route, they passed another wounded soldier, and Desmond could see this man's wounds were worse, more immediately life-threatening. The decision came instantly and without debate. Take him. He needs it more than I do. He crawled off the litter and told the bearers to help the more critically wounded man first, and he did it without hesitation, giving up his place without protest or hesitation. As he lay there with untreated grenade wounds, exposed and unable to move quickly, while he was waiting for the litter bearers to return, he was hit again by enemy fire, and the blast and impact left him with a severe fracture in one arm. His arm was shattered, muscles torn, bones splintered, and the injury alone could have ended his life through blood loss or shock. Desmond found a discarded rifle nearby and used its stock as a splint, binding his own mangled arm with strips torn from his uniform. He worked slowly, fighting dizziness and pain, relying on the same calm focus he used on others. Then, unable to stand because of leg wounds, unable to use his left arm, he began to crawl. With a rifle stock bound to his shattered arm as a splint, he crawled 300 yards over rough terrain to reach the aid station, and he did it while still under threat. 300 yards when every foot must have sent waves of agony through his body, when stopping would have been easier than continuing. The official citation recorded the facts in plain language, but it could not fully show the choices he made while he was wounded, and still trying to protect others, while on his way to the battalion aid station for treatment of wound number 1, was hit by a sniper's bullet. The language was precise, efficient, and emotionally empty, as such documents were designed to be. What those clinical descriptions didn't capture were the choices. The choice to treat himself rather than risk another medic. The choice to wait 5 hours under fire. The choice to give up the stretcher. The choice to bind his own shattered arm and crawl 300 yards rather than dying where he fell. These were not heroic gestures performed for recognition. They were practical decisions made under pressure, guided by conscience and habit rather than fear. And that's the thing about Desmond Doss that made him different from any other Medal of Honor recipient. Unlike in the 2016 film, he didn't achieve the incredible on just one day. He did it again, and again, and again, often without witnesses and without pause. His war was over, but his recognition was just beginning. October 12th, 1945. The East Room of the White House. President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around Corporal Desmond Doss's neck, recognizing something unprecedented in American military history. The first conscientious objector to receive the nation's highest military decoration. The first man to earn it without ever carrying or using a weapon in combat. The room included senior officers, government officials, and military guests who had come to witness the ceremony, all watching a moment that quietly rewrote a long-held assumption about what American heroism was supposed to look like. The paradox must have struck everyone in that room. How do you reconcile the traditional understanding of military courage, built around killing the enemy and taking ground, with this man who saved lives instead? For generations, courage had been measured in advances made and enemies destroyed. Yet here stood a quiet medic, whose battlefield victories could only be counted in heartbeats restored and bleeding stopped under fire. Perhaps the answer was that Desmond Doss forced America to expand its definition of courage. Heroism didn't require a rifle if you had enough faith and determination. The traditional calculus of warfare had to make room for different mathematics. 75 American soldiers alive who would have died. Perhaps the most fitting testimony came from that soldier on Okinawa who'd thought to himself, watching an unarmed medic treat him under fire, "Now here's a warrior." In that moment, stripped of speeches and medals, courage revealed itself not as aggression, but as self-sacrifice. A warrior, it turned out, could be someone who knelt instead of charged, who healed instead of destroyed, and who stayed when retreat would have been reasonable. In his final years, Desmond returned to Okinawa to revisit the place where he'd saved 75 lives. In his later years, Desmond returned to Okinawa to revisit the place where he had saved so many lives, and officers who had once doubted him later admitted that it was there they learned how brave he truly was. Standing together on that ridge, two old men looking at a landscape holding so many memories, Glover readily admitted what he'd learned decades earlier. Desmond Doss was the bravest man he'd ever known. The wind moved through the grass, and the silence said as much as the words did. The complete transformation was there in those words. From the harsh words of rejection he faced during training to the bravest man I ever knew. From rejection to recognition. From contempt to respect. It was not only one man's journey, but the Army's, and in some ways the nation's. Desmond Thomas Doss passed away at home in Piedmont, Alabama, on March 23, 2006, aged 87. A long life, full of quiet dignity and faith. He never sought fame, and he never tried to turn his story into something larger than it was. He simply lived the same way he had served. They had called him Holy Joe in 1942, and they hadn't meant it kindly. They had ridiculed him, ostracized him, and tried to break his spirit. They had doubted he would survive combat. And for a time, it must have seemed like their doubts were justified, especially on Okinawa, where survival itself felt uncertain. But Desmond Doss proved that courage doesn't require a weapon if you have enough faith. He proved that one man, acting from principle and refusing to compromise his beliefs, could make a difference rippling through 75 lives and all the families connected to them. He proved that the truest warriors are sometimes the ones who save, rather than kill, who run toward danger unarmed, who pray, "Lord, help me get one more," while everyone else prays just to survive. In April 1945, the men of Company B climbed a jagged cliff into hell, not knowing whether they'd survive the next 7 days. Fear followed them every step of the way. By May, they knew one thing with absolute certainty. If they got hit, Desmond would reach them. No matter the position, no matter the fire, no matter the odds. He would come, because that was who he was. The medal tells part of the story. The citations tell another part. But the full truth of Desmond Doss lives in the hearts of 75 men who made it home from Okinawa, and in the children and grandchildren those men were able to raise because someone with faith and courage saved their lives on a ridge called Hacksaw. They had laughed at the unarmed medic who wouldn't touch a rifle. By the time he left Okinawa on a hospital ship in May 1945, nobody was laughing. They had learned what real courage looked like. They had learned that sometimes the bravest soldier is the one who saves lives instead of taking them. And they had learned to be grateful that Desmond Thomas Doss, the skinny kid from Virginia who believed in faith more than fear, had climbed that cliff with them and refused to let them die alone. If this story moved you, if you believe that courage comes in many forms and that faith can be stronger than fear, please subscribe to our channel. Every week we bring you stories of extraordinary Americans who changed history, some with weapons, some without, but all with courage that still inspires us today. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we explore the true stories that Hollywood only begins to capture. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.